The post-mortem on the Trump presidency. Hi there, thanks for joining us for another plain English lesson. I'm Jeff, JR is the producer, and this is lesson number 316. You can find the full lesson at plainenglish.com/316. Set aside the tweets, set aside the personality, set aside the chaos in personnel and the other controversies of the Donald Trump presidency. Set aside even what you think about what Trump did as president. In this lesson, we'll talk about how Trump's accomplishments compare to what he promised to do. Think of it as a report card using the criteria he himself set out in the 2016 campaign. To start our post-mortem, let's start at the beginning. One of Trump's first priorities was to change our system of health insurance. When he took office, Trump promised to repeal and replace a big healthcare bill passed during the Obama administration. He didn't have much of a legislative strategy beyond the slogan, repeal and replace, and his effort failed in Congress. This was a huge defeat, and it came early in his presidency. However, he later notched up some wins. Trump delivered on several economic promises. First, he passed a tax reform bill, and this is his biggest policy success as president. The reform lowered our corporate tax rate, making American companies more competitive in the world. It lowered rates on most individuals and corrected some imbalances in the tax code. This was a big win for him, but it would be the high water mark of his legislative agenda. Trump also drastically reduced the regulatory burden on businesses as he promised. For those interested in a business-friendly climate, the reduction in regulation was welcome, a significant ongoing win for Trump throughout his presidency, even if it didn't get much publicity. What about on trade, one of Trump's favorite topics? He spooked business across North America when he pulled out of NAFTA, a continent-wide trade agreement. But he settled nerves again when he negotiated a replacement treaty. This represented little net change to the prior agreement among Canada, Mexico, and the United States. We can call this a Trump victory in appearance only. Other trade partners were not so lucky. America pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a vast regional trade agreement, and stalled progress on trade with Europe. The Trump administration used trade as a weapon and imposed tariffs on China and other countries. This did protect some American jobs, but at great cost to the economy overall. This can be considered a draw, neither a win nor a loss. Overall, though, the American economy did very well during the Trump years. What about his other accomplishments? Apart from the tax cuts, criminal justice reform was the only other notable new law passed in the Trump era, and the only significant law that passed with the support of the opposite political party. This reduces the long mandatory prison sentences, reduces the population in federal prisons, and supports programs to help former prisoners re-enter society. This was a big Trump win and figured heavily in his re-election campaign. Judicial appointments were a huge promise kept. Through a combination of luck and shrewd political maneuvering, Trump had the opportunity to appoint 3 new justices to our 9-seat Supreme Court, the most of any one-term president since the 1950s. What's more, he worked closely with his party leaders in the U.S. Senate to confirm dozens of conservative-leaning federal judges to lower courts. Watching him work through judicial appointments was like watching a totally different Donald Trump. He was highly effective, shrewd, and, dare I say, disciplined. This was a huge win for him. Trump famously promised to build a wall along the southern border and to make Mexico pay for it. At first glance, this was a bust. Only token sections of a border wall were built, and Trump got along unexpectedly well with the Mexican president, a fellow populist. But immigration, both legal and illegal, did slow during Trump's presidency. Security at the border has increased, and fewer people applied for temporary or permanent residency. So while the wall didn't get built, and while the southern border remains dysfunctional, the flow of immigration did slow. Call this a partial victory for him. Trump came to office promising to drain the swamp. That was a tongue-in-cheek reference to Washington, D.C.'s geography. The city was originally built on a swamp near the Potomac River. What he meant was that he would clear out the corrupt insider politicians and replace them with competent people. He did neither. He didn't clear out corrupt political insiders. He even needed them, as any politician does. But he also introduced his own brand of corrupt insiders and installed his family members and political donors to key positions. An unusual number of his associates were indicted and convicted of crimes. Very little about corruption in Washington improved during his time there, and drain the swamp barely figured in his re-election campaign. This would have to be a loss. How about Trump's foreign policy? He moved America's embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, both crowd-pleasing moves to his base and promises kept. He promoted himself as a big deal maker, saying he could personally solve a lot of the world's problems. He signaled support to the opposition in Venezuela, but didn't follow through and didn't get any results. Ever the showman, he flattered North Korea's dictator and claimed to make friends with him, but this didn't result in any change, either for good or ill. He is slowly backing away from the longest war in America's history in Afghanistan and started no new conflicts. America's reputation in the world suffered during Trump's presidency, but that hardly mattered to Trump himself. Judging by his own priorities, Trump's foreign policy was probably neither a huge success nor a huge failure. There was one big foreign policy success, however, and that was the Abraham Accords. This is the set of agreements between Israel, on the one hand, and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and other countries in the Middle East and Africa on the other. These agreements establish normal relations between Israel, a major American ally, and countries that had previously refused to recognize it. This is a huge win for Trump's administration, but it came too late. The news was lost among COVID and the next election. Whatever you think of his priorities and actions, this list of accomplishments was about average for a first-term president. He got some big wins, a few small wins, suffered a couple of stinging defeats, and fought to a few draws. The economy did well. Even with all the drama, the Twitter, the impeachment, the feuds, and the controversies, it would probably have been enough to win him a second term, if not for COVID. It was strange to look back on this. It feels like we've lived 20 years of drama in 4 years of elapsed time. It is also strange to think that Trump's accomplishments were not too different from what a generic Republican would have done. It's just that it was shrouded in a cloud of constant controversy that it was hard to even think about what was truly going on. What a weird time. By the way, a post-mortem is like an evaluation of how you did after the fact. It's often done after a loss of some kind. If you work in professional services, you probably make proposals. In that line of work, you win some and you lose some. But after you lose, it's helpful to look back and see what you did well and what you didn't do as well. That's called a post-mortem, or an analysis you did after something is over. This is a great expression today, figure in. It's a phrasal verb, and here's how you heard it in today's lesson. Trump kept his promise to reform the federal criminal justice system. That victory figured in his re-election campaign. In this sense, we mean that this victory played a part in his re-election campaign. He kept a promise, and he bragged about that promise later when running for re-election. His promise figured in his campaign. He also promised to drain the swamp. Do you remember what that meant? He was going to clean up corruption. That didn't exactly happen, and drain the swamp did not figure in his re-election campaign. That slogan was not a part of his re-election campaign. Play a part. That's the best way to think about figure in. Here are a few more examples. We talked about the decision to buy a new car or a used car in a recent lesson. What factors would figure in your decision to buy a used car? What factors would play a part in your decision? You would probably consider the price, selection, and reliability. You may decide that the additional risk is worth it because it carries a more affordable initial price tag. Those factors figure in your decision to buy a used car. When I most recently bought a car, well, not too recently, it was 4 years ago. Anyway, the brand reputation of Mazda, the price, the body style of the car, and the options all figured in my decision. But I need to be honest, one of the biggest factors that figured in my decision was that Mazda makes a lot of cars with a manual transmission, which is my preference. Most other car makers don't offer that at all here in America, if you can believe it. To be sure, that wasn't the only thing I was thinking about, but it did figure prominently in my decision. If something figures prominently in a decision, it's one of the most important factors. Your company may lease its office space. If the lease comes up for renewal, the company has a big decision to make. Should it keep the same amount of office space in the future or reduce it? Your company's culture and ability to work at home would probably figure in the decision to lease office space in the future. If working at home is easy, then maybe your company can afford to rent less office space in the future. If that's impossible, then maybe it needs more space to maintain social distancing. But either way, the work culture would probably figure in any decision about office space. If you've been watching TV commercials lately, you might have noticed that social distancing, safety, and contactless shopping all figure prominently in advertisements. They all play a prominent part in advertisements. Many companies proudly talk about their delivery options. Others emphasize their safety protocols. Either way, safety and social distancing figure prominently in advertisements. You can figure something into your plans. If you're going to have a wedding and you invite 100 people, you don't want to buy 100 meals. You need to figure in an RSVP rate. You need to figure in the percentage of people who will decline your invitation. If you want to play golf on a Saturday, you might figure in the weather forecast before heading out. If it's going to rain in the afternoon, you might want to reserve an early tee time so you can be off the golf course in time. You'll figure the weather forecast into your plans. Today we did a post-mortem. I said it was a useful way to look back on the times you lost a competition and evaluate how you did. That's a post-mortem. But if you fail, it's not always comfortable to look back on your failure. That hurts sometimes. I think it's necessary, but it hurts. Well, here is a dissenting voice. It is the Greek playwright Sophocles writing in Oedipus Rex. Here's the quote: "I have no desire to suffer twice, in reality and then in retrospect." I have to say, he has a point. It's bad enough to suffer the first time. No need to suffer again by spending too much time looking back on it. Speaking of suffering, this is the worst time of the week, isn't it? Right when our time together is coming to a close. But of course, you can enjoy our rich library of lessons online at plainenglish.com. You know I'd love for you to join as a Plus member, but at the very least, join as a free member. That gives you access to our full lesson library, hundreds of expressions, lesson topics, and more, all for you at plainenglish.com. Coming up on Thursday, a major discovery about water on the moon. A few years ago, scientists found water in the dark and cold, cratered parts of the moon's surface. But a new discovery shows it's in more places than previously thought. We'll explore that, so to speak, on Thursday. See you then.